I'm from Texas. I was born in El Paso, and then when I was 3, we moved to Austin, and that's where I've been ever since, in the Austin area. My parents did move when I was in middle school to a smaller town, a rural town outside of Austin. So I had a little bitty tiny high school. Graduating class was 50 people, and it was small enough where on occasion I rode my horse to school because it was fun. I actually do not remember not knowing how to sew. My mom says she taught me when I was 3. I do remember not being able to use the scissors. So I would be making dresses for my dolls and I would hand stitch them, and then I wasn't allowed to use the scissors, so I'd have to take my scrap fabric, which I'd gotten from her because she knew how to sew, and I would, Mom, I need you to cut here just like this. And then I would run back to my room and I would do some stitching and decide I needed another cut, and I'd run back to her and I need you to cut it here. And so she would do those things, and then I'd come back eventually and show her, here's the doll dress that I made. I do remember being 5 when she taught me to use the sewing machine, and she drew lines on fabric, and I had to before I was allowed to try to sew anything, I had to try to sew on top of her pencil lines on the fabric. And when I was good enough at that, then I was allowed to attempt to sew a thing other than lines. A lot of doll pillows, that kind of stuff, doll sleeping bags. And then I just kept sewing all through middle school, high school. If it was too complicated, I would get my mom to help. She did things like she sewed my prom dress, she sewed my wedding dress. So it's something that has been in our family for a long time. She actually learned to sew because my grandmother knew how to sew, because everybody did at that time. But my grandmother bought, in the 1960s, she bought this brand new fangled Singer sewing machine, and it came with lessons. And she didn't actually want to sew on the machine. It's just, you had them in the household back then. So she sent my mom to the lessons that came with the machine because she didn't want to go, and she thought somebody should know how to use it. I started my blog back in 2011, and I was teaching at the time. That was actually my last year teaching, and it started because I had a hard time finding things that I wanted for my little boys to wear. They were 1 and 3 at the time, and I just didn't like some of the choices, especially for special occasions, for them to wear. So I had an Etsy shop with some of the items that I had made for them to wear. I would sew multiples and then sell some of them on my Etsy store. And everybody was like, well, if you have an Etsy store, you need to have a blog. And so I was like, okay, I'll start a blog. And then I really enjoyed the blogging more than creating items to sell on Etsy. So once I figured out that I could sell patterns, and that I could gain a readership from posting sewing tutorials on my blog, then I decided this is what I like to do. So in 2012, I had started selling some of my patterns, and I was at a crossroads with my career. My husband is a football coach. I was a theater teacher. Nobody was home with our small children because he was at football practice. I was at rehearsal after school. And so we were seeing our kids for 30 minutes to an hour before bedtime when we got home. So he and I talked about it and decided that there is some money coming in from these patterns. I wonder what I could do full-time if that was my job, if I was home with the kids and then when they were sleeping or at preschool or something, then I was working on the blog. And that just kind of led one opportunity to another, and I've been doing that ever since 2012. I quit teaching. A lot of women find themselves frustrated with how ready-to-wear clothes fit, and so they take up sewing, and then they find themselves frustrated with how sewing patterns make them fit. And I think we don't teach sewing in schools anymore, so a lot of things like how to adjust patterns to fit you, those skills aren't taught. And they used to, like in my grandmother's age, or even when my mom was a teenager, those skills were kind of assumed. And this is now something that you have to seek out because it's not just handed down. It's not a skill that everyone knows, like how to boil an egg. So one of the reasons that they're so frustrated though with fit is the way that the standards were first created for women's sizing. They decided it was during World War II, they needed standardized sizing for uniforms. And so it came through the Army was where it started, that they wanted to measure everyone and get kind of an idea of what is the average sized person, what are their measurements, instead of everybody measuring themselves and basically getting bespoke clothing. So they put out a call to have women volunteer to go get measured so that they could compile all this data and like come up with average measurements. But the thing was, the women that were likely to respond to this call were people who, because they offered like a small payment for it. So that it was people who really needed that money, which was generally more impoverished people who tended to be thinner and have smaller frames. And especially between World War II era and now, the frame sizes have changed so much, and not all of the pattern makers or clothing makers have updated their measurements to some of the newer standards that are out. So it can get really frustrating, particularly when you see some of these older patterns that are commercial patterns holding on to their sizing from World War II, and we're just not shaped the same as we were, if we were even shaped that way at that time, because they sampled such a small, specific subsection of people, and then they just decided these are the averages for all people. So it's something I think valuable to learn, and it really makes you feel better when you can make clothes that fit you.